Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. A storm brewing in the skies. The early morning sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows of the bustling airport terminal, painting the polished floors with streaks of gold. Aisha Harris walked briskly toward Gate 14, her leather carry-on slung over one shoulder and a cup of steaming coffee in her hand. She had always been a punctual traveler, valuing the calmness of the airport before the usual chaos of boarding and delays. Her sharp blazer and tailored slacks, paired with a silk scarf, reflected her commitment to professionalism and elegance. Aisha was a corporate consultant, traveling frequently for work. Her current assignment involved a high-stakes presentation to secure funding for a community development project she had been spearheading for months. Despite the weight of her responsibilities, she carried herself with an air of quiet confidence. This flight, she thought, was just another routine journey, a small hurdle in her path to achieving something impactful. As she approached the gate, she noticed the growing line of passengers waiting to board. Families, business travelers, and vacationers shuffled in anticipation. Aisha took her place at the end of the priority boarding queue, double-checking her boarding pass and ID. The airline staff, dressed immaculately in their uniforms, moved briskly behind the counter, calling out boarding groups and assisting passengers. Aisha's calm demeanor was momentarily interrupted when a loud commotion arose a few feet away. A middle-aged man argued with the gate agent about an oversized carry-on. The agent, maintaining a professional tone, refused to allow the bag on board. Aisha watched the exchange with mild interest, thinking how thankless the job of customer service could be at times. Finally, her group was called to board. She handed her boarding pass to the smiling gate agent, who scanned it and wished her a pleasant flight. Stepping onto the bridge, Aisha felt the familiar blend of anticipation and routine that always accompanied air travel. The plane's interior was immaculate, with rows of seats neatly aligned and flight attendants assisting passengers with their luggage. Aisha made her way to her assigned seat in the premium economy section. She stowed her carry-on in the overhead compartment, ensuring her coffee cup remained steady in her hand. Settling into her window seat, she took a moment to appreciate the view of the aircraft wing and the morning sky beyond. She pulled out her tablet, intending to review her presentation slides during the flight. As the plane filled with passengers, the flight attendants began their rounds. They were a team of 3, each dressed in crisp uniforms and exuding the polished professionalism expected of the airline. Among them was a senior flight attendant, Clara, whose commanding presence suggested years of experience. Clara moved through the cabin, checking seat belts and luggage storage. Her tone was brisk, her smile perfunctory. When she reached Aisha's row, Clara paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Excuse me, ma'am," Clara said, her voice edged with a sharpness that caught Aisha off guard. "You'll need to store that coffee cup before takeoff." Aisha looked up, meeting Clara's gaze. "Of course," she replied, her tone measured. "I was just about to finish it." Clara's expression hardened. "It needs to be stored now. It's a safety regulation." Aisha nodded, taking a final sip before securing the cup in the seat pocket. She sensed an unusual tension in Clara's demeanor, but decided not to dwell on it. After all, following safety protocols was standard procedure. As the flight prepared for takeoff, Clara continued her rounds, her interactions with other passengers similarly curt. Aisha noticed a pattern. Clara's tone softened significantly when addressing passengers who appeared to be business executives or affluent travelers, but it became noticeably rigid with others. Aisha couldn't help but feel a subtle undercurrent of bias in Clara's behavior. The flight took off smoothly, and the passengers settled into their routines. Some read books, others watched movies or dozed off. Aisha immersed herself in her presentation, her fingers gliding over the tablet screen as she fine-tuned her slides. An hour into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew prepared for the beverage service. Clara and her colleagues wheeled carts down the aisles, offering drinks and snacks. When they reached Aisha's row, she requested a cup of tea and a small packet of pretzels. As Clara handed over the items, her hand brushed against Aisha's, causing a minor spill of hot tea onto the tray table. Aisha flinched but quickly grabbed a napkin to clean the spill. "It's all right," she said calmly, more concerned about not disturbing the passengers around her. Clara, however, did not acknowledge the incident. Without a word, she moved to the next row, her back turned to Aisha. Aisha hesitated, debating whether to let the matter go. The lack of an apology for what was clearly an avoidable mishap bothered her. Deciding to address it, she leaned slightly into the aisle and said, "Excuse me, Clara. Could we have a quick word?" Clara turned, her expression one of mild irritation. "Yes? I wanted to bring up the tea spill earlier. I understand accidents happen, but an acknowledgement would have been appreciated." Clara's eyes narrowed, and her tone grew defensive. "Ma'am, I have over 100 passengers to attend to. If I stopped to apologize for every little thing, we'd never finish service." Aisha's brows furrowed. The dismissive response felt unwarranted. Keeping her composure, she replied, "I understand you're busy, but respect and courtesy don't take much time." Clara's lips tightened. "Is there anything else you need?" she asked, her tone icy. "No," Aisha said, leaning back in her seat. She felt the weight of nearby passengers' eyes on her. The exchange had been quiet but unmistakable. Minutes later, a ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Clara had resumed her duties, but her demeanor had grown even more brusque. Aisha, now unsettled, returned to her tablet, determined not to let the incident distract her further. Unbeknownst to Aisha, the quiet storm brewing in that cabin was about to escalate. And at its center stood Clara, whose actions were about to trigger consequences far beyond her expectations. The spark of change. The hum of the airplane's engines filled the cabin, mingling with the subdued chatter of passengers and the occasional clink of glasses from the beverage cart. Aisha Harris tried to refocus on her work, scrolling through the meticulously prepared slides on her tablet. The confrontation with Clara was minor in the grand scheme of things, yet it left a lingering discomfort that she found difficult to shake. Moments later, the beverage service concluded, and Clara and her team retreated to the galley at the back of the plane. Aisha's focus wavered as she overheard snippets of conversation from the row behind her. "Did you see how she spoke to that woman?" whispered a middle-aged woman to her companion. "So rude. That flight attendant has no sense of decorum." Aisha felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. She wasn't looking for validation or sympathy, but knowing others had noticed Clara's behavior confirmed that her concerns weren't imagined. Just as Aisha tried to bury herself in her presentation, Clara returned to the cabin. This time, her interactions with passengers seemed sharper, more dismissive. When a young mother inquired about warming a bottle for her infant, Clara's response was a curt, "I'll get to it when I can," leaving the mother visibly flustered. Aisha took a deep breath. She wasn't one to seek confrontation, but the repeated lack of empathy from Clara was unsettling. It wasn't just about her anymore, the flight attendant's behavior was impacting multiple passengers. Determined to address the issue constructively, Aisha pressed the call button above her seat. Moments later, a junior flight attendant, a young man with a friendly demeanor, approached. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I assist you?" he asked, his tone professional yet warm. Aisha smiled politely. "Thank you for coming. I wanted to bring something to your attention. I've noticed that one of your colleagues, Clara, has been quite curt with several passengers, myself included. I'm sure the job can be stressful, but her tone and mannerisms have been less than professional." The young attendant's eyes widened slightly. "I'm very sorry to hear that, ma'am. We strive to ensure all passengers feel respected and comfortable. I'll relay your concerns to the team lead." "I appreciate that," Aisha replied, her voice steady. "My intention isn't to escalate unnecessarily, but I felt it was important to mention." The attendant nodded and excused himself. Aisha leaned back in her seat, hoping that her measured approach would lead to some resolution. She wasn't expecting an apology, but hoped for an improvement in Clara's demeanor. Meanwhile, in the galley, Clara's irritation simmered. The junior flight attendant approached her hesitantly, relaying Aisha's feedback with as much tact as he could muster. "Clara, a passenger shared some concerns about interactions in the cabin," he began. They felt some exchanges were a bit abrupt. Clara's eyes narrowed, and her posture stiffened. "Is that so?" she said, her voice clipped. "Well, perhaps some passengers are too sensitive. I'm doing my job under challenging conditions." The junior attendant shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just passing along the feedback. Maybe it's worth addressing, just to keep things smooth?" Clara waved him off. "Noted," she said dismissively, returning to her tasks. Back in her seat, Aisha observed the subtle changes in the cabin dynamics. Clara's curt attitude persisted, but now it carried an edge of defensiveness. Aisha couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. Nearby passengers exchanged glances, their unease growing with every interaction Clara had. As the flight continued, the tipping point came during the meal service. An elderly man in the aisle seat across from Aisha politely asked Clara for an extra napkin, explaining that he had spilled some water. Clara's response was unnecessarily sharp. "Sir, you should be more careful," she said, handing him a single napkin. "We have limited supplies." The man's face fell, and he muttered a quiet, "Thank you." That was it. Aisha couldn't stay silent any longer. She pressed the call button again, this time with a firmer resolve. The captain of the flight, David Reynolds, had been monitoring cabin operations through periodic updates from the crew. He prided himself on running a smooth flight, and his open-door policy encouraged the crew to report any issues promptly. When the junior flight attendant approached him in the cockpit to relay the growing concerns about Clara, David's brow furrowed. "Sounds like we need to address this," he said. "Passenger satisfaction is paramount. Let me speak with her." The captain made his way to the galley, his commanding presence turning heads as he entered. Clara was busy arranging trays when she noticed him. "Captain Reynolds," she said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" "Clara, we've received multiple complaints about your interactions with passengers," he said, his tone firm but measured. "I'd like to understand what's going on." Clara's expression darkened. "With respect, Captain, I'm doing my job as I always have. If some passengers feel differently, perhaps they're misinterpreting my intentions." "Perception matters," David replied. "I need you to reflect on how you're engaging with passengers. Professionalism and empathy are non-negotiable." Clara's jaw tightened, but she nodded curtly. "Understood." Aisha watched as Captain Reynolds exited the galley and spoke briefly with the junior flight attendant. His visible engagement offered a glimmer of reassurance. A few minutes later, Clara returned to the cabin. Her demeanor was slightly more subdued, though traces of tension remained. As the flight neared its destination, the passengers settled into a quieter rhythm. Aisha used the time to reflect on what had transpired. She felt a mixture of frustration and hope. Frustration that such behavior still occurred, but hope that her voice, combined with others, might lead to change. Unbeknownst to Aisha, the incident had already sparked internal discussions among the crew. Captain Reynolds made a mental note to escalate the matter to corporate upon landing. What Clara didn't realize was that her actions, and refusal to accept feedback, were about to bring her face to face with the airline's highest authority. A reckoning at 35,000 feet. The cabin buzzed softly with the hum of the engines as the plane leveled at cruising altitude. Passengers settled into their routines, reading, chatting quietly, or watching in-flight entertainment. Aisha Harris, seated by the window in row 12, pulled out her tablet to review a presentation for the conference she was headed to. The tranquil moment was shattered when a sharp voice pierced the air. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s, with a name badge reading Laura, spoke curtly. She stood by Aisha's seat with a tightly controlled expression. "You can't have your bag there. It needs to go in the overhead compartment." Aisha looked up, startled. "Oh, I'm sorry." I thought personal items could stay under the seat in front. Laura sighed loudly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. That bag is too large. It needs to go overhead. Aisha glanced at the small leather carry-on that fit snugly under the seat. It was no larger than any other passenger's personal item. It's actually within the size limits, Aisha said calmly, her voice steady but firm. I double-checked before boarding. Laura's eyes narrowed. I don't have time for this. Either it goes in the overhead bin, or I'll have it moved for you. The tension in the air was palpable as passengers began whispering among themselves. Aisha remained composed. I'd like to understand why this is an issue. Other passengers have similar-sized bags. Laura crossed her arms. Ma'am, I've given you instructions. Please comply. It was a moment of decision. Aisha could have conceded, avoiding further conflict. But something about Laura's tone, a mix of condescension and irritation, pushed her to hold her ground. I'm happy to comply if you can explain why my bag, which meets the airline's guidelines, needs to be moved. Laura's face reddened. I don't have to explain myself to you. The nearby murmurs grew louder. A middle-aged man across the aisle chimed in, her bag is fine where it is. What's the problem? Laura shot him a glare, before turning back to Aisha. Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, I'll have to escalate this. Please do, Aisha said, her tone unwavering. She wasn't looking for a fight, but refused to be dismissed without reason. Moments later, Laura returned with the senior flight attendant, a man named James, whose calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to her agitation. What seems to be the issue here? He asked, addressing Aisha. Aisha explained the situation succinctly, her voice devoid of anger but full of resolve. James inspected the bag and nodded. It appears to fit the guidelines. There's no need to move it. Laura's jaw tightened. But... Thank you, James, Aisha interjected, her gratitude evident. She returned to her tablet, assuming the matter was resolved. However, Laura wasn't done. As James walked away, she muttered under her breath, loud enough for Aisha and nearby passengers to hear, some people just love to make everything difficult. Aisha froze. The words stung, not for their content but for their implication. She turned to Laura, her gaze steady. Excuse me, what did you just say? Laura's eyes darted around, realizing too late that she'd been overheard. I was just commenting on the situation. Your comment was uncalled for and disrespectful, Aisha said, her voice firm but composed. I'd appreciate an apology. Laura smirked, crossing her arms. I don't owe you an apology. The cabin fell silent. All eyes were on the confrontation. Aisha's calm resolve contrasted sharply with Laura's defensive posture. I'm asking for a basic courtesy, Aisha said. If that's too much, I'll be sure to address it with the airline. Laura scoffed. Do whatever you need to do. Aisha nodded, pulling out her phone to document the interaction. She wasn't one to let injustice slide, especially when it came wrapped in subtle prejudice. 5 minutes later, a ripple of shock moved through the cabin. A passenger seated in first class stood up and walked toward Aisha's row. It was a man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. A few passengers recognized him and began whispering, "Isn't that the CEO of the airline?" The man, Gregory Palmer, introduced himself to Aisha with a warm smile. Ms. Harris, I couldn't help but overhear what just happened. May I have a word with you? Aisha nodded, slightly taken aback but grateful for the intervention. Gregory turned to Laura, whose face had turned pale. Ms. Laura, he said, his voice measured but firm, please join us. The CEO gestured for them to step into the galley for privacy, but the cabin's silence indicated that everyone was hanging on every word. I want to apologize personally for what you've experienced, Gregory said to Aisha. This is not the level of service or respect our airline stands for. Thank you, Aisha replied. I appreciate your acknowledgement, but this situation could have been avoided with basic respect and accountability. Gregory turned to Laura, who looked down at the floor, avoiding his gaze. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" he asked. Laura stammered. "I didn't mean for it to escalate. I was just following protocol." "No," Gregory interrupted, his tone sharp. "What you were following was your personal bias and a lack of professionalism. This passenger was well within her rights to ask for an explanation and, when denied that, to request an apology. Instead, you doubled down and disrespected her." Laura's mouth opened as if to protest, but she thought better of it. Gregory continued, "I'll be honest. I don't tolerate this behavior in my company. You're relieved of duty, effective immediately. Another staff member will take over your responsibilities for the rest of this flight." The cabin gasped audibly as Laura, stunned and humiliated, was escorted away by James. Gregory turned back to Aisha. "Ms. Harris, I deeply regret that this incident occurred. Please know that we take these matters very seriously, and I assure you this will be addressed further." Aisha nodded. "Thank you. I hope this leads to meaningful change." As Gregory returned to his seat, the cabin erupted in quiet applause. Passengers exchanged knowing looks, and several leaned over to commend Aisha for her calm and courage. Back in her seat, Aisha felt a mix of emotions, relief, vindication, and a quiet hope that standing up for herself had made a difference. It wasn't just about her, it was about setting a precedent, about ensuring that respect wasn't optional, no matter where you were or who you were dealing with. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully, but the impact of what had transpired lingered. By the time the plane landed, the story was already making waves, shared by passengers on social media, their posts lauding Aisha's grace and the CEO's swift action. What began as a moment of tension became a powerful testament to the importance of speaking up against injustice, no matter how subtle or overt. Aisha's calm but firm stance reminded everyone aboard that change starts when you refuse to accept less than respect. The ripple effect of courage. By the time Aisha exited the plane and stepped into the terminal, her phone was buzzing incessantly. Texts, emails, and social media notifications piled up as passengers shared their accounts of what had happened. Several had recorded parts of the interaction, and videos of the confrontation between Laura and the CEO had already gone viral. Aisha hesitated as she opened one of the videos, unsure of how she felt about her experience becoming public knowledge. The clip showed her calmly asking for an explanation, Laura's dismissive response, and the moment Gregory Palmer intervened. The comments beneath the post were a mix of admiration, outrage, and support. "This is exactly the kind of leadership we need. Kudos to the CEO for stepping in. Aisha handled this with such grace. She's an example to us all. Sad that this kind of behavior still happens in 2024. Aisha sighed. The attention was overwhelming, but she knew the story had struck a chord. As she collected her luggage and headed to her next gate for a connecting flight, she resolved to focus on the reason she had traveled in the first place, the business conference where she was slated to deliver a keynote address. The following morning, Aisha stood in the green room of the conference venue, preparing for her speech. Her topic was resilience in the corporate world, but now her own experience was becoming an unplanned case study. She debated whether to mention the incident but decided against it, not wanting to overshadow her professional message with personal anecdotes. As she stepped onto the stage, the applause was deafening. The audience, a diverse group of professionals from various industries, was eager to hear her insights. Aisha delivered her speech with poise, sharing strategies for overcoming adversity, building confidence, and fostering equity in leadership. After the presentation, a young woman approached her during the networking session. "Ms. Harris, I saw the video from your flight," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "You inspired me to stand up for myself in a situation at work today. I'm sure you've heard this a lot, but thank you." Aisha smiled warmly. "I'm glad to hear that. Remember, change starts with one voice, but it grows when others join in. Keep advocating for yourself and others." Meanwhile, the airline faced the fallout from the incident. The videos circulating online had drawn media attention, with news outlets covering the story as a testament to both corporate accountability and the ongoing challenges of addressing bias. The hashtag #RespectTakesFlight began trending, with people sharing their own experiences, both positive and negative, with customer service and discrimination. In response, Gregory Palmer issued a public statement. At our airline, we pride ourselves on delivering exceptional service and fostering an inclusive environment for all passengers and staff. The incident on Flight 742 was unacceptable and does not reflect our values. While we have taken immediate action, we recognize the need for deeper systemic changes. Effective immediately, we are launching a comprehensive training program for all employees to address unconscious bias and ensure every individual is treated with dignity and respect. The airline also announced a partnership with advocacy groups to develop best practices for inclusivity in the travel industry. The moves were widely praised, though some critics questioned whether the actions were merely performative. 2 weeks later, Aisha received an email from Gregory Palmer himself. It was an invitation to meet at the airline's headquarters to discuss her experience and share her insights on improving customer service. Aisha was initially hesitant but agreed, recognizing an opportunity to contribute to meaningful change. When she arrived at the sleek glass building that housed the airline's executive offices, she was greeted warmly by Gregory and a team of senior executives. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Harris," Gregory said, leading her to a conference room. "We've reviewed the incident extensively, but we'd like to hear directly from you about how we can improve." Over the next 2 hours, Aisha shared her perspective, focusing on actionable steps the airline could take. Enhanced training, she suggested mandatory, ongoing training for all employees on cultural sensitivity, conflict resolution, and effective communication. Customer feedback loop, Aisha emphasized the importance of creating accessible channels for passengers to report concerns and ensuring that those reports were taken seriously. Diverse leadership, she highlighted the need for diverse representation in leadership roles to drive systemic change from the top. Gregory listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. By the end of the meeting, he extended an offer: "We'd like to bring you on as a consultant to help us implement these changes. Your insight and expertise would be invaluable." Aisha hesitated. She already had a demanding career and wasn't sure if she wanted to step into this new role. But the thought of making a tangible impact was compelling. "Let me think about it," she said. "I'll get back to you soon." As Aisha left the headquarters, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. What began as an unpleasant confrontation had grown into a movement for accountability and respect. The ripple effect of that moment on the plane was undeniable, not just for her, but for countless others inspired by the story. Later that evening, Aisha drafted a post for her professional social media account. "Sometimes, standing up for yourself means standing up for others too. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every action we take can lead to progress. I'm grateful for the support I've received and hopeful for the changes to come." The post quickly gained traction, with comments from people across the globe sharing their stories and thanking her for her courage. Aisha's inbox overflowed with speaking invitations, collaboration requests, and messages of support. Though the journey had been unexpected, it reaffirmed her belief in the power of resilience, dignity, and speaking truth to power. A ripple through the skies. The chaos from the earlier incident on Flight 728 seemed to have subsided as the plane approached its final destination. However, beneath the surface, the implications of what had happened were far from resolved. Aisha Harris, the calm yet firm woman at the center of it all, sat quietly in her seat, gazing out of the window. The serene blue sky stretched endlessly before her, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had erupted mere hours ago. The immediate aftermath. The flight attendant, Caroline, who had refused to apologize to Aisha earlier, had been escorted to the back of the plane after a terse announcement from the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you of an incident involving one of our crew members. We assure you this matter is being addressed and thank you for your understanding." The murmurs among passengers had not ceased since the moment the altercation took place. Aisha's refusal to let the injustice slide, her simple but powerful demand for respect, had struck a chord with everyone on board. Her quiet dignity in the face of blatant disrespect had transformed her into a symbol of resilience and grace. Meanwhile, in the airline's corporate headquarters thousands of miles away, the CEO, Eleanor Marks, sat in her office, her expression darkening as she read the rapidly escalating reports pouring in. News of the incident had already hit social media. A passenger's post, complete with a video of the flight attendant's dismissive behavior and Aisha's composed response, had gone viral. The hashtag Justice for Aisha was trending. Eleanor was not one to ignore such matters. A former flight attendant herself, she understood the critical importance of empathy and professionalism in customer service. She immediately initiated a direct line of communication with the flight captain, demanding a detailed report and asking to speak with Aisha directly upon landing. A conversation at 35,000 feet. As the plane descended for its final approach, the captain emerged from the cockpit and approached Aisha. "Ms. Harris," he said, his tone respectful but tinged with unease. "The CEO of our airline, Eleanor Marks, would like to speak with you as soon as we land. She has been briefed about the incident and wishes to address it personally." Aisha nodded. "I'm happy to speak with her," she replied. Her voice, steady and calm, betrayed none of the exhaustion she felt. Caroline, seated in the rear of the plane, watched the exchange with a mixture of disbelief and apprehension. It had become clear to her that her actions had set off a domino effect far greater than she had anticipated. She replayed the moment in her head, Aisha's simple request for an apology and her own stubborn refusal. For the first time, regret began to creep in. The confrontation. Once the plane landed, Aisha was escorted to a private lounge where Eleanor Marks awaited her. The CEO rose to greet her, extending a hand. "Ms. Harris, thank you for taking the time to speak with me," she began. "First, let me start by offering you a personal apology for what you experienced on our flight today. This behavior is unacceptable, and I assure you it does not reflect our company's values." Aisha shook her hand, appreciating the sincerity in her tone. "Thank you, Ms. Marks," she replied. "But an apology from you, while appreciated, doesn't address the root of the issue. Respect should be a given, not something customers have to fight for." Eleanor nodded gravely. "You're absolutely right. That's why I've already begun taking steps to ensure this doesn't happen again. Caroline has been removed from her duties effective immediately, and we're implementing a comprehensive review of our training programs to emphasize cultural sensitivity and respect." Aisha's eyes met Eleanor's, searching for authenticity. "It's a start," she said after a pause. "But I hope this incident serves as a reminder that words and actions have weight. It's not just about policies, it's about creating a culture where everyone feels valued." Eleanor looked at her thoughtfully. "Ms. Harris, you've inspired more than just our team today. The way you handled this situation with dignity and strength is something we can all learn from. If you're open to it, I'd like to involve you in our efforts moving forward, to help us better understand and address these issues." The ripple effect. As news of the incident spread, so did the impact of Aisha's actions. Passengers from the flight shared their experiences, praising her poise and determination. The airline's swift response earned cautious approval, but it was Aisha's story that captured the hearts of people around the world. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor kept her promise. She invited Aisha to participate in a series of workshops aimed at improving the airline's customer service and inclusivity practices. Together, they developed a program that included real-world scenarios, cultural competency training, and an emphasis on empathy. Caroline, the former flight attendant, took time to reflect on her actions. After attending one of the workshops herself, she reached out to Aisha to offer a heartfelt apology. Though hesitant at first, Aisha agreed to meet with her. Their conversation was honest and emotional, leading to a moment of mutual understanding. A new standard. The airline, now under intense scrutiny, took bold steps to ensure such incidents would not happen again. They publicly committed to transparency and accountability, sharing updates on their progress with the public. Eleanor's leadership and Aisha's involvement became a model for other companies to follow, sparking a broader conversation about respect, equity, and the power of standing up for what's right. For Aisha, the journey was far from over. But as she stood at the gate of another flight weeks later, preparing to board, she felt a renewed sense of hope. She knew her actions had created ripples that extended far beyond that single flight. And as she stepped onto the plane, greeted warmly by a flight attendant who looked her in the eye and smiled, she realized that sometimes, even the smallest acts of courage can change the world.